He had been there since 1969. Not a term, not a decade, 54 years, from the time Lyndon Johnson was president to the post-pandemic Chicago of the 2020s, from the era of the Chicago Democratic machine under Mayor Richard J. Daley to the independent reform era, through every political seismic shift in Chicago's history. Edward Michael Burke had been in the same seat, alderman of the 14th Ward, Southwest Side, the heart of the working-class Irish and Hispanic Chicago neighborhoods that Burke had made his political base. He was the longest-serving alderman in Chicago City Council history. He was the chairman of the Finance Committee, a position that gave him authority over every financial transaction the city undertook, over every tax incentive, every permit, every city contract. He was described over decades by the Chicago Sun-Times, Chicago Magazine, and political analysts as the most powerful alderman in the history of Chicago City Council. The man who, in a city with a well-documented relationship with political corruption, was consistently identified as its most consequential political insider. The FBI raided his office on November 29, 2018. Agents arrived at Chicago City Hall, the building where Burke had worked since 1969, ejected his staff, and papered over the windows and doors with brown paper. The entire city could see it. The office of the most powerful alderman in Chicago was sealed by federal agents. Burke continued serving for another 4 years. He did not resign. He ran for re-election to the city council in 2019 after the raid. He won. He continued serving as alderman in the same seat, in the same building, for 4 more years while federal investigators built the case against him. On December 21, 2023, a federal jury in Chicago convicted Edward M. Burke, 79, on 13 of 14 counts of racketeering, bribery, attempted extortion, and related federal offenses. 13 counts, unanimous. On charges that describe the most powerful alderman in Chicago's history, running the Finance Committee as a personal racket, using the specific leverage that 54 years in the same seat had given him to extract private legal work for his personal law firm from every business, developer, and institution that needed anything from the city of Chicago. On June 24, 2024, U.S. District Judge Virginia Kendall sentenced Burke to 2 years in federal prison and a $2 million fine. Prosecutors had sought 10 years. Burke's lawyers had sought home confinement. 2 years, for 54 years, for racketeering, for bribery, for the most sustained public corruption operation in the recent history of American municipal government. Judge Kendall had received more letters of support for Burke than she had ever received for any defendant in her judicial career. She said so from the bench. More than 200 letters describing Burke's acts of kindness, his community service, his generosity to ordinary Chicagoans over 5 decades. She sentenced him to 2 years anyway. Corruption in the Chicago City Council tears at the fabric of a vital body of local government. Let's go back to 2016 and build the full picture of what Burke's corruption actually looked like in operation. Clafter & Burke, a private property tax law firm founded and operated by Edward Burke alongside his career as an alderman. The firm specialized in seeking property tax reductions for corporate clients, a service that, given the Finance Committee chair's specific authority over tax matters before the Chicago City Council, created an obvious commercial opportunity for anyone doing business with the city who understood that the Finance Committee chair had a law firm that could help them. Burke was not the finance chair and the law firm principal in different compartments. He was both simultaneously. The power of the Finance Committee position was the commercial value of the law firm. The law firm was the mechanism by which the Finance Committee position was monetized. The specific schemes prosecuted at trial: the Old Main Post Office, a development project transforming Chicago's historic downtown post office into a commercial and residential complex. The developers needed tax increment financing, a specific financial mechanism that required Finance Committee approval. When the developers didn't hire Clafter & Burke, Burke allegedly used his position to block their progress. When they remained resistant, the pressure continued. The Burger King, a franchise restaurant in Burke's 14th Ward that needed permits for a renovation. The owner was steered to Clafter and Burke for property tax work. The firm's fees would be the price of getting the permits processed through a ward office that Burke controlled. When the Burger King owner didn't hire the firm, the permits moved slower. The Binny's Beverage Depot, a liquor store on the northwest side seeking city approval for a pole sign. The developer's interest with the city could be advanced or impeded by the Finance Committee's cooperation. The price of cooperation: legal work for Clafter and Burke. The Field Museum, not a development project, an internship. Burke learned that the Field Museum, a major Chicago cultural institution, had not considered his goddaughter for an internship position. His response: threatening to block a fee increase that the museum needed city council approval to implement. The museum hadn't hired his firm, but there was a leverage point available. Clout for sale. Through each of these schemes, Burke was converting his 54-year institutional position, the specific authority that comes from being the Finance Committee chair, the most powerful alderman, the man that every developer and institution doing business with Chicago needed to work with, into private income for his personal law firm. What's your red? When an alderman who has held the same seat for 54 years uses his Finance Committee authority to extract private legal work from businesses that need city cooperation, is this the corruption of a previously honest institution or the natural endpoint of a political culture that allowed one person to accumulate unchecked municipal authority for 5 decades? Type A if the corruption is primarily personal. Type B if the institutional structure enabled it. Drop it in the comments. The mole. The specific mechanism that made Burke's conviction possible was a former colleague who had himself been caught in FBI crosshairs and had decided to cooperate rather than face charges. Former Alderman Danny Solis, who represented the 25th Ward from 1996 to 2019, was confronted by the FBI in 2016 with evidence of his own criminal conduct. Solis agreed to cooperate. He wore a wire. For 2 years, 2016 and 2017, he recorded his interactions with Burke. More than 100 secretly recorded videos and audio conversations. Burke, in those recordings, discussing the schemes with the directness of a man who had done this for decades and had never faced serious consequences. The voice on the recordings, the specific language of a man explaining to a colleague how the system worked, how businesses that needed things from the city would be directed to his firm, how the Finance Committee's authority would be deployed to create the leverage that made that direction productive, how the specific details of each arrangement would be managed to maintain the appearance of ordinary commercial relationships. Burke had no idea the conversations were being recorded. He had no idea that Solis, who had been doing this alongside him for years, was now producing the evidentiary record that would eventually convict him. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because the specific question of why the FBI raid on November 29, 2018 did not immediately produce a guilty plea or a resignation, and what it says about a 79-year-old alderman's assessment of his own legal exposure that he continued serving, ran for re-election, won, and continued for 4 more years, is the specific psychological element of this case that the sentence of 2 years doesn't fully address. Burke's defense at trial was essentially, I used my position to generate business for my law firm, but what I did was not illegal. That property tax work for clients who had business before the city was legitimate commercial activity, that the line between political relationships and criminal extortion had not been crossed. The jury found on 13 counts that the line had been crossed, clearly, repeatedly, with specific intent and specific leverage. Burke was 79 at conviction. He was 80 when sentenced. Judge Kendall acknowledged in explaining the 2-year sentence, rather than the 10 years prosecutors had requested, that she had considered his age. She had considered the letters, 200 of them, from people whose lives Burke had genuinely touched over 54 years of constituent service. She had considered the complexity of disentangling a life of genuine service from a career of criminal corruption. She imposed 2 years and a $2 million fine. The $2 million fine is going to the victims of Burke's crimes. specifically including $65,000 in restitution to the owners of the Burger King he extorted, a franchise restaurant in the southwest side of Chicago, whose owner needed permits and instead got an extortion scheme from the most powerful alderman in the city. These investigations, FBI Chicago Field Office coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, represent the specific commitment to prosecuting political corruption in the city that has produced more federal convictions of public officials than any other American municipality in the modern era. If this level of detail is what you come here for, a thumbs up is the best way to support this work. Was this justice? 2 years for 54 years in office? 13 counts of racketeering and bribery? The most sustained municipal corruption operation in Chicago's modern history, with a $2 million fine going to the victims? Or does the gap between the 10 years prosecutors sought and the 2 years actually imposed, shaped by 200 letters of support for a man who spent decades enriching himself while serving the public, represent something about how American courts balance personal accountability with lifetime service that the specific crimes don't fully resolve? Drop your verdict in the comments. One detail, the one the public record contains that defines what the 2-year sentence produced in practical terms. June 8, 2025, less than 9 months after Burke surrendered to federal prison in September 2024, he was transferred from the Federal Correctional Institution in Thompson, Illinois, the low-security facility where he had been serving his sentence, to community confinement, a halfway house. The remainder of his sentence served not in a federal prison, but in community supervision. His supervised release was scheduled to end on February 20, 2026. In March of 2026, Edward Burke would be a free man. 54 years in office, 13 federal convictions, 2 years sentence, 9 months in prison, then a halfway house, then home. The judge's 2-year sentence, shaped by 200 letters and by Burke's age, produced approximately 9 months of actual incarceration for the most powerful municipal official in Chicago's history to be convicted of running his office as a criminal enterprise. The zagadka of this case is not the conviction. The jury's verdict was clear. The zagadka is what 9 months says about what American law considers appropriate accountability for 54 years of corruption in one of the most consequential municipal political positions in the country. Judge Kendall said at the sentencing, "It seems to be a problem without an answer." She was talking about whether criminal sentences deter political corruption. She may have been right. What stays with you? The 54 years? The specific accumulation of power that made the corruption possible? The Burger King? The franchise restaurant that became the emblem of the scheme? The 200 letters? And what they say about the gap between community service and criminal conduct? Or the 9 months of actual incarceration? And what it says about what accountability looks like for the most powerful alderman in Chicago history? Let's discuss it below. One more number, the one the case record contains in Danny Solis's specific contribution to the conviction. 2 years, the period during which Solis wore the FBI's wire, 2016 and 2017. 2 years of recordings that eventually produced the 100-plus secretly recorded videos and audio conversations that the prosecution presented to the jury. 2 years during which Burke, the most powerful alderman in Chicago history, the man who had operated at the center of city politics for nearly 5 decades, spoke freely in meetings and phone calls with a colleague who was recording everything. 2 years of recordings, because Solis agreed to cooperate rather than face charges that would have ended his own political career. The FBI's approach to Chicago corruption has, over decades, relied heavily on exactly this mechanism. Finding a person inside the network, confronting them with evidence of their own wrongdoing, and offering the cooperation option that turns one case into 2. Solis produced Burke. Burke's case is part of a broader Illinois political corruption investigation that has also produced the prosecution of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan, sentenced to 7.5 years in April 2025, and related cases that have dismantled a generation of Illinois political power. 2 years of recordings, from a man who wore a wire for the FBI for 2 years while continuing to serve as an alderman alongside the colleague he was recording. The 2 years of recordings produced 13 convictions on the most consequential public corruption trial in Chicago in a generation. The 2-year sentence for those 13 convictions produced 9 months of actual incarceration. The math of accountability and the math of corruption have specific values in the Chicago Federal Courthouse. One person recording for 2 years produces 13 convictions. 13 convictions produce 9 months in prison. Whether that math represents adequate deterrence for the next alderman, considering whether to use the Finance Committee chair's position to generate private law firm business, is the question that Judge Kendall said seems to be a problem without an answer. She may have been right. The recording is over. The sentence is done. The Finance Committee still exists. The city still requires permits and approvals and tax incentives. The next person in that seat has a clearer view of the risk than Burke had in 1969. Whether a clearer view of a 9-month outcome is sufficient deterrence is the zagadka that the Chicago political machine has been navigating for more than a century.